Now, thank you for coming today. Now, I'm going to do this lecture a bit differently to normal. The PowerPoints will just be a few pictures that you can look at, but I'm going to deliver it in the old-fashioned way, while I'm mainly speaking, without much text or any text on the PowerPoint. Now, today's lecture is in honour of David Maschmedt and his major contribution to land and soil description in Australia. And I'll get started by mentioning a few facts about David, and that includes that he was an agricultural science student here at this hallowed institution, the Waite Agricultural Research Institute, a number of years ago now. And I'll follow my information about David with a look at key aspects of the development of land and soil information. Now, for those of you that don't know David's work, I think most here probably would, I hope by the end of the presentation you'll recognise David as a real pioneer in soil science. And there are a number of possible reasons why people might not know about his work. And he has not worked in a research institute with a focus on publishing. He's not been a university academic with numerous journal articles to his name, nor does he have a high H index, whatever that is. And he's not been involved in reductionist science, where the aspects of the world are broken down to individual problems to be solved and understood by laboratory work. But he has, however, been involved with the production of land and soil mapping information. And he has been involved in the integrated science, or another word might be holistic science, if that makes sense, where numerous factors in the environment are considered together. And he has worked for state government with a practical focus on better land and soil management and condition. And the reasons for doing this are for benefiting the environment, for benefiting the economy, and for general benefit to society, or what is called the triple bottom line. Now, as an aside, what is becoming less well understood, I think, is, and including within state government itself, is that in Australia, state governments have the constitutional responsibility for land use and management. It's not the national government. Now, this has huge implications for funding, development and coordination of information about land and soils. And it's not the case in most other nations, like the US, for example, where there's a national responsibility. Now, those who have worked directly with David or benefited from his input to their projects are universally impressed with his knowledge and integrity, his logical, systematic and innovative approach, his ability to contribute constructively, prolific output and quality of his work, and highly developed work ethic. Now, because of these traits, even those who don't quite understand what it is David has done are still impressed by him. And that included a number of managers in state government. Now, David founded and led the highly successful South Australian Land and Soil Mapping Program. And because of his leadership and sheer physical and mental effort, no other jurisdiction in Australia and possibly the world, someone would need to research that a bit better, but I think that's probably the case, has such a consistent and comprehensive body of land and soil information, and I'll explain more about that later. No, that's what I should have had that slide up. Now, David was a founding and long-term member of the National Committee on Soil and Terrain. It had a different name when it was founded, but that's what it's called now. It's the peak body for land and soil in Australia. And some of the other key founding members were Neil Mackenzie and Noel Shopnick from Western Australia. Now, the National Committee on Soil and Terrain is a national coordinating committee which is part of the National Council of Australian Governments committee system. It advises on land and soil policy, coordinating Australian land and soil information gathering, which, as I explained earlier, is not easy to coordinate nationally because the states have responsibility for doing that. It's the manager of the Australian Collaborative Land Evaluation Program, and the Australian Soil Resource Information System. It's the manager of the National Soil Archive and manager and producer of the Australian Soil and Land Handbook Series, Soil and Land Survey Handbook Series. Now, the handbook series, as you probably know, includes the yellow book, which is for soil and site field description guidelines, the blue book, which is land and soil mapping and spatial analysis guidelines, the Australian soil classification, soil physical measurements handbook, soil chemical methods handbook. And so it's quite, even that in itself is quite a lot for the committee to handle. Now, David has been honoured in the National Awards System of Honours, owing to executive managers in government recognising his remarkable and outstanding achievements. David was awarded the Centenary Medal in 2001 on the centenary of Federation of the Six Australian Colonies for service to the public sector by leading the construction of a land, resource and soil database. And that was 100 years, it was just over 100 years ago. It was Australian colonies, not anymore, of course. On Australia Day 2010, David was awarded the Public Service Medal. It was only one of two awarded to public servants in South Australia that year for outstanding public service in the areas of land resource assessment and land evaluation. Now we'll get on to the main part of the presentation, and in this presentation I'll cover key aspects of the development of land and soil description with a focus on Australia and especially South Australia, and at the same time highlight David's involvement and contributions, especially as the leadership of the South Australian Land and Soil Mapping Program. Now, the subtitle of this talk, where it is "Where have we come from, where are we going and the issues of our time," indicates that I'll start by giving a brief historical perspective, followed by key developments in the last few decades and a look at the latest technologies. The last part of the subtitle means I'll attempt to show the impact good land and soil information can have on many of the major issues facing both the world and Australia. Now, what is land and soil description and why do we do it? Now, so it's data and information about land and soils, and that includes information about sites and landscapes, information about individual soil profiles, and information about spatial entities. We develop these data and information to know more about the resources we're managing and that we're developing policies for, and for the efficient allocation of resources. Now, I know that's a very economics term, but it means we need to put the resources where they need to go to benefit, for maximum benefit to society, not waste resources. Now, in the beginning, as long as humans have engaged in agriculture, there have been observations about different areas and the way animals and plants thrive or otherwise. Many cultures have also developed ways of improving soil, especially via the return and incorporation of organic matter in the form of manure. Now, the prime objectives of agriculture, as well as gardening, have always been to maintain and enhance soil fertility, reduce disease and pests, loosen and aerate the soil, and that's to provide a suitable environment for germination of seeds, for seedling growth, and so plants aren't limited by hard layers, and also to try and keep the soil in place to minimise erosion. Now, in the early days of South Australia, land was often assessed in terms of its potential fertility and water holding capacity by soil surveyors, not soil surveyors, land surveyors, who were marking out boundaries for settlement. And this was generally in terms of just good, moderate or poor land for agriculture. Agriculturists themselves, the farmers themselves, then discovered the potential for their own land over time through trial and error. Now, famously in South Australia, this resulted in what I've called the Great Southward Retreat of cropping in South Australia, when in the 1800s it was realised wheat farmers had ventured too far northward into lands with rainfall too low and too unreliable for cropping. That retreat, though, happened over a lot of decades. However, at the time, general rainfall patterns weren't known, although they probably could have been predicted by vegetation indicators, and they were previously by the Surveyor General Goyder. Now, in fact, as late as the 1940s, annual average rainfall was not known with any certainty in some prospective agricultural areas. On Western Kangaroo Island, where Keith Northcote and others did soil mapping there, they developed an annual average rainfall map, which is out by about, I'll say it in the old terms, 8 or 10 inches on Western Kangaroo Island, what they estimated the rainfall to be. So as late as that, they didn't really know how much rainfall parts of the agriculture areas were receiving. And that land was being opened up for farming under a soldier settlement scheme post World War II. Now I'll just talk a little bit about early soil surveys and mapping. Now the first detailed and systematic soil surveys and mapping were conducted for earlier soldier settlement schemes, so this is after World War I, in irrigation areas being established along the River Murray, and it was mostly by the CSIR and what became the CSIRO. And maps like this of the Barossa were produced. Now, so later the CSIRO conducted a range of land and soil surveys for various purposes using various methodologies in a number of South Australian regions and other Australian regions. Now that was especially the case in the southeast of South Australia, which was also being opened up for agriculture. And of course the development of understanding of soil trace element deficiencies and what to do about them was a crucial part of all this. At the same time, soil profile information was recorded in small notebooks. Richard Merry, who's a bit of a soil historian, has some of the old notebooks that some of the CSIRO soil surveyors used, and it's all just written in pencil and longhand. It would have descriptions like the same as previous but redder, or the same as the last but shallower. And so this information was not meant for wider distribution. It was purely collected to help the soil science develop a soil type or a soil class map. Now I'll talk a bit about soil profile description and classification. What the soil scientists was doing when they were recording about soils in their little notebooks was soil description. What he then did was group his various soils into categories, soil classes or soil types, and that's soil classification. So soil description and soil classification are not the same. I notice these days a lot of people seem to get that all mixed up. Soil classification is really just a subset of soil description. And soil description is more important and more useful than just giving something a name. Soil description describes the key elements of each soil, while soil classification attempts to categorise soils into generic types for mapping and other purposes, which by necessity simplifies the data you have, results in data loss, but it has the aim of making the environment and any map that's produced easier to understand, because the environment is a complicated place. So science and soil mapping attempt to simplify and make systematic things about the environment to enhance our understanding. So soil classification categories are differentiated by key soil differences considered important for the use that the corresponding maps are intended for. So that might be, usually that's agricultural land use and management, or it might be land use planning, and there's a lot of other uses as well. And such differences might be soil depth, which is a key indicator of water holding capacity, soil texture, which is a key indicator of inherent fertility, or soil colour, which is a key indicator of soil drainage. Now, soil classification summarises soil characteristics, aids communication, and can provide a framework for data management. And soils are classified for the same reasons that numerous other entities are classified. Now, just stepping back in time again about understanding of soils, historically soils were just considered arable surface layers or superficial geological deposits. It wasn't really known that soils had their own formation processes that produce materials unique to soil, and that includes the clay minerals, which are different from the minerals in the parent rock. And the main processes that form soils had not been described. I didn't draw that, by the way. I pinched that off the internet. Now, that is until the late 1800s, when Vasily Dokhachev and his fellow Russian soil scientists were the first to realise that soils were independent natural bodies with their own unique properties, constituents and origins. Now, these were revolutionary concepts. And I'm going to give you a quote now from the USDA in 1951, which I love. And it says, after realising this, soil scientists did not need to depend wholly upon inferences from the geological nature of rocks or from climate or from other environmental factors considered singly or collectively, but could go directly to the soil itself and see the integrated expression of all these in its morphology. Now, in effect, this thinking brought about the study of soil science. And if you're able to read it, each soil profile provides a natural history lesson, and sometimes that covers many millions of years. Oh. Now, the Russians were the first to comprehend the importance of the 5 soil forming factors: parent material, climate, topography, biological influences and time. And American and Australian counterparts took up these ideas. The early Russian soil classification system placed strong emphasis on climate and vegetation as fundamental indicators of soil properties and key soil forming factors. Now, in Australia, J. Prescott, who was the first director of the Wade Institute, devised the first classification of Australian soils, and this is the map he made in 1931 on a continental scale. It had 10 map units. And what intrigues me about this map is those gigantic map units that just got a label of one soil. You have to be a confident man to do that. It's given one soil name for gigantic areas. In 1944, he revised the map and it had 18 map units. He based his system on the Russian system, using names like desert sandhills, mallee soils, podsilized soils, red brown earths, indicating what were considered soil-forming vegetation communities and climate. But he also recognised the grey age of many Australian landscapes and soils, which added complications to the Russian zonal approach. And most groups were based on morphology rather than external factors or interpretations of genesis. Now, as a pedologist, the one thing that gets pedologists fired up and gets a lot of disagreement happening is interpreting the origin of soils, as well as attributing soil horizons to soils. So if you want to see an argument between pedologists, just get them to do one of those two things. Now, C.G. Stevens expanded and modified this system in his Manual of Australian Soils, 1953, 1956, 1962. In 1962, he had devised 47 great soil groups. The Soil Landscapes of Australia was a map he produced in 1961 at the scale of 1 to 5 million, which is a more detailed scale than that one you're looking at. It had 32 map units, so we're getting more knowledge about soils, more knowledge about the Australian continent. Mind you, this is 1961. It's not that long ago. He developed a hierarchical nomenclature similar to a biological classification system. It had soil orders, suborders, great soil groups with further divisions and families, series, types and phases. And the use of that word type in a specific sense is the reason why a lot of pedologists are reluctant to use the term soil type as a general term, because it has specific meaning in Australia and has specific meaning in the US. Now you can see here the parallel development of classification schemes and maps, as the classification schemes were primarily developed to represent soils on maps. And that's not the actual cover, by the way, but that's all I could find. The culmination of this sort of thinking led to the development of the Handbook of Australian Soils in 1968, which was based on great soils groups with fantastic names like Terra Rossa, Solidized Solanets, Krasnism, Chernism, Podzol, Red Brown Earth. Now a lot of those names you can hear the Russian influence. And these names have captured the imagination and are still used to this day. These groupings provided an effective means of communication, but they were vaguely defined, and whole groups of soils were left out. I mean, there's a whole range of soils in South Australia that look like red brown earths but are gradational soils that just weren't part of these systems. There was also no key, so repeatable and objective classification was not possible. Reasons such as this led Keith Northcote to develop his factual key for the recognition of Australian soils. There were 4 editions from 1960 to 1979. This was an improvement in that it could differentiate between many more soils, was objective and repeatable, and included some excellent ideas, like the idea of the different texture profiles, whether you had texture contrast soil or uniform texture or gradational texture, as well as the main subsoil colour class being integral. However, it wasn't able to differentiate soils on all major features of importance to land use and management. For example, carbonate layers were not considered, and also some soils have no suitable factual key classification. But Northcote and others also produced the Atlas of Australian Soils from 1960 to 1968, which was at a scale of 1 to 2 million. There were 111 map units just in South Australia, 10 maps covering Australia and with corresponding reports, and it included great soil group and factual key nomenclature. This is actually a version of the Atlas of Australian Soils you're looking at here, but it's the old soils names have been replaced with Australian soil classification names, or just orders. Now we're getting to the mapping of the state mapping program. This was the state of play when the state land and soil mapping program got into full swing in 1990 after a three-year pilot program looking at potential methodologies. David and others had experience of the great soil groups and factual key systems, and knew they couldn't fully distinguish between and categorise soils that were known to be different and important in different ways, or different in important ways. Now, there was a previous State Department of Agriculture Soil Conservation Branch publication, The Soils of South Australian Farmlands, in 1960, and this best distinguished broad soil groups used for agriculture in South Australia, and was based on knowledge gained on soil behaviour over a long period by state government soils officers, and so, although very general, it was a good starting point. The soil scientists associated with the state land and soil mapping program began fieldwork in various South Australian districts describing soil profiles and landscapes. And the described soils somehow had to be categorised to support information management and mapping. There was no suitable system in Australia. This is in 1990. In South Australia, we flirted with using the US soil taxonomy. Wayne Hudnall from Louisiana State University came out here a number of times. I think Rob might have brought him out. Am I right there? Rob Fitzpatrick. Yeah, Rob brought him out. And over a number of field trips looking at soil pits and trying to classify them according to soil taxonomy. Firstly, we didn't have the data in a lot of cases, but it really could only distinguish between South Australian soil types at a very gross level, and all the differences we wanted to pull out it just couldn't do. Meanwhile, soil scientists surveying soils across South Australia had to meet at various soil correlation meetings where procedures and methodologies were standardised, but also soil categorisations were compared from one district to another. Now, this was a very laborious process, and it was like, I'll show you yours, you show me mine, so, well, what have you called this group of soils? Then came the tremendous godsend when Raysville CSIRO in Queensland got underway developing what became the Australian Soil Classification, with the first edition in 1996. David Maschmedt, Bruce Billing and myself were enthusiastic supporters, and once a workable version of the scheme was produced, it was quickly integrated into the South Australian mapping program. And all of a sudden, we had little need for soil correlation meetings anymore. Our correlation was done by the Australian Soil Classification. Now, David had a great influence on the development of the Australian Soil Classification, and many of its major features exist as a result of his input. The Australian Soil Classification combines many of the best features of the factual key with a structure based on soil taxonomy. It contains a hierarchy of orders, suborders, great soil groups, subgroups, and with a family level that includes A horizon thickness, A and B horizon texture classes, surface gravel and soil depth. These are the things you want to know about soils. In the ASC, the family level is very important. The scheme is now the accepted national standard. It's easy to use. It's based on morphology, not interpretations, which is good for pathologists for the reasons I've mentioned before. It requires minimal chemical data and discriminates between soils that were not previously separated. Nonetheless, this is a national and generalised scheme, and there's still a need for additional and complementary systems tailored to particular regions or particular land uses or environmental problems like acid sulphate soils. A state-based system, as documented in the book The Soils of Southern South Australia, developed for South Australia via the State Land and Soil Mapping Program, focuses on geographically relevant soils and reflects key features affecting land use and management. For example, in South Australia there's much more emphasis on the presence of different carbonate layers than in the national scheme. But note that the South Australian scheme is complementary to the Australian soil classification. It's not a replacement. Now, I'll get on to soil description and mapping. So far I've mostly focused on soil classification, not mapping or soil description. Now, firstly, I'll mention just how the Yellow Book transformed and standardised soil description when it first appeared in the mid-1980s, and it also standardised and transformed data storage, because as before, as I said, it was just all longhand stuff written in notebooks. There was no national standards, and what you described was just up to you, although that's still the case to a degree. It's worth noting that performing a full soil description is the key to having long-term useful soil data, rather than just recording one or two characteristics, which often happens when people have particular projects and they just want to know one or two things about the soil. And most soil sites will never be visited again, so it's really worth getting all the information you can from that site. Now I'll speak a bit more about soil mapping. Soil maps have traditionally shown soil types or classes, and map development was greatly improved when aerial photographs came on stream in the 1940s. But the use was limited by the presentation of soil type only on the maps. So you needed interpretation by a soil scientist for really any use of the map or any other use of the map, for example, crop suitability. And that soil scientist needed to be familiar with the classification scheme and probably familiar with the area in question as well. Landscape information was generally not provided and had to be inferred or possibly read about in the corresponding report. Scale was usually too broad for uses in planning, or often too broad for uses in planning and agriculture. Mapping methodologies varied widely, so one map just didn't correspond with another map. You couldn't compare apples with apples. Subdominant soils were often not adequately recorded, or sometimes not recorded at all. And that's why that Prescott map intrigues me, where he's got whole swathes of Australia just with one soil, one soil name. Soil information was limited to what the classification scheme was able to provide. And often the full classification scheme wasn't used anyway. It might just be an order name and a suborder name. Limited or non-existent printing, computer and positioning technologies all limited what could be produced and what could be done. Information associated with maps was qualitative, so it was descriptive, not quantitative. Strangely enough though, once maps like these, with these limitations, had been produced, it was thought in many places across the world, including in Australia, that further soil mapping was unnecessary. That is mind-boggling to me, but this was mostly, I guess, by national scientific agencies that probably once they'd done their level of mapping were quite happy that they'd done their work and they went on to other things. But as I've just pointed out, most of the mapping was not of the standard or scale to be used in any real sense. However, I'll go on to developments in South Australia now. Rapidly increasing awareness of environmental issues in the mid-1980s caused a resurgence of state government interest in the importance of sound use and management of landscapes and soils, and the need for supporting data and information which is both up-to-date and easy to use. Now, in addition, before the start of the State Land and Soil Mapping Program, there were different philosophies of map presentation on display in this state by state government soil scientists. For example, Ken Weatherby's soil map of the Eyre Peninsula only used names. So I just had a list of names that were just names he'd made up. So it forced you, if you wanted to know anything about that map, to go to the report and look at the name and look at the description under the name. David Maschmedt, in stark contrast with his Central Adelaide Hills soil maps, attempted to include all relevant information on the map itself. So just in this state, there's an interesting contrast there. Anyway, in the 1990s, Commonwealth funding programs came on stream, and armed with previously unavailable computer technology, so this is GIS, state government soil scientists embarked on a new era of land and soil assessment. This is the State Land and Soil Mapping Program, as it's now called. The aim of this work was to generate a consistent mapping coverage of the entire agricultural zone with a clear focus on resource management and at scale suitable for use in planning. Earlier CSIR, CSIRO and Department of Agriculture surveys provided an invaluable basis for the state mapping program. However, all map unit boundaries and descriptions were newly developed for the sake of consistency. Now, one of the main differences, another place in Australia that has pretty good mapping is Western Australia, but they didn't do that. They used old boundaries, and it means for not quite the same level of consistency. Now, there was a significant hiatus in survey work between the mid-1970s when CSIRO and the old Department of Ag people had stopped doing any soil survey work, and the mid-1990s, after which state mapping program information began to come on stream. But what to map? Firstly, scale and map unit type needed to be decided upon. The scale, we decided on 1 to 50,000 scale in the more intensively used land. And that's, you can see where the smaller squares are, here, in the more intensively high rainfall agriculture areas of South Australia, and Lower York Peninsula because it's quite a complicated area. And 1 to 100,000 in the less intensively used agricultural land. It was also to be all land, or all non-arid land in South Australia, so all parks, reserves, areas of vegetation were also to be mapped. Now, how to map the boundaries? What are you going to map as the boundaries? Well, firstly, it would all be one project area, so the methodologies would be consistent everywhere. Soil landscape map units will be mapped, and land systems will be mapped. Now, you may not know this, but in Australia they're totally separate disciplines. People tend to map land systems at 1 to 250,000, and that's a separate exercise, and then they map soil landscape map units to say 1 to 100, 1 to 50,000. That's a separate exercise. The two don't match even if they're done in the same area. We just decided to aggregate up soil landscape map units to form land systems. So we developed a hierarchy of mapping units right to biophysical regions. There's 5 levels. And we would use stereoscopic pairs of air photos, and the air photos available then were very good, and that is a form of remote sensing. Now, what to describe spatially? Well, this was mostly a soil conservation project at the time. I was employed in 1990, and at that stage we were mapping water erosion potential and wind erosion potential, 2 things, in a framework of soil landscape map units. And that framework's key to this as well. Now, water erosion potential and wind erosion potential are soil attributes, or they could be called land attributes. The basis for classifying these attributes came from work in the USA. There's a chap called Maschmedt who talked about this at an Inter-American Natural Resources Symposium in 1948, where generalised land capability classes were used to assess land for farm planning and soil conservation purposes. This is this land class stuff from 1 to 8 that you've no doubt heard about. This method had been picked up by state government soil conservation branch officers. Russell wrote about it in 1950, Baer wrote about it in 1956, and Gettenbeck, who in 1956 as well, who went on to work at the university and was one of my lecturers. As a way of encouraging better land management practices to conserve soil in South Australia, owing to great concern about the effects of wind and water erosion, especially in the undulating cereal growing districts in the northern agricultural areas. This method was also adopted in some other Australian states, and most notably in New South Wales, where they have similar country to what we have in the northern agricultural areas. This method of generalised land capability classification, combined with farm planning, was a great success in both Australia and the USA. Using this scheme, over 400 farm plans were produced by soil conservation branch staff in South Australia in consultation with farmers. And by the mid-1960s, agricultural practices had well and truly turned the corner so far as wind and water erosion were concerned. That's a comment by Harriet, who was South Australia's first soil conservator. Consequently and subsequently, the generalised land capability classes of the USDA fell out of favour. They were considered too general, too focused on soil conservation, especially water erosion control, and not crop specific. However, David Maschmedt maintained an interest in the system and the potential to modify it for other more specific uses. David took a later version of the US Generalised Land Capability classes by Klingbeil and Montgomery in 1961 and applied them specifically to the land attributes of wind erosion and water erosion. Now, the earliest recorded version of the classification criteria for these attributes that I've been able to find is in the South Australian Department of Ag Soil Conservation Technical Manual, which was handed out to new soils officers when they started in 1986. It was the very start of the pilot program, first pilot program of the State Land and Soil Mapping Program. Now, this was a great leap forward and set the scene for significant later developments in South Australia, nationally and globally. No longer was the 8-class scheme used for generalised land classification with an eye to better control of wind and water erosion. Now the 8 classes were applied to each land or soil attribute individually to classify quantity, nature or condition. Each attribute could now be mapped as a single parameter of the landscape as classes, and as such they became semi-quantitative or quantitative, depending on the attribute. And importantly, they could be used as parameters in spatial modelling, although that wasn't thought about at the time. I've just put up on the screen, this is a brief summary of the water erosion classification criteria that have been used in South Australia. There's much more information about that, but that's the brief summary. The 2 land attributes of wind and water erosion were then mapped within a framework of soil landscape map units in selected areas as part of an initial pilot program of the State Land and Soil Mapping Program. Subsequently, the full program also began mapping these attributes across the whole agricultural zone. Now, the reason we're mapping wind and water erosion potential was the initial soil conservation focus of the project, of the program. Focus on providing information to non-technical users and requirements of recently enacted soil conservation and land care legislation requiring soil conservation branch boards to prepare district plans, so maps and associated data were required. And note, interestingly, that everything was open. There were no standard methodologies from elsewhere to follow, which still intrigues me. Now, the full mapping program. Pretty soon it was realised that mapping wind erosion and water erosion land attributes was not enough. Concern about rising saline water tables affecting agriculture and other land meant that water table induced salinity was added to the attributes to be mapped, and classification criteria were developed. So there was a lot of base information that the South Australian Department of Agriculture had that David was able to bring into a classification system mostly based on vegetation indicators. Now, by the start of the so-called MEGA project in 1992, classification criteria for 15 land and soil attributes had been established. So we started in 1990 mapping 2 attributes. I was hired to map York Peninsula and Kangaroo Island in 3 years. 2 years later we're mapping 15 attributes. So the 3 years was a little bit short. A large number of other attributes were added between 1992 and 1998. And I have to say here, we had tremendous support from Andrew Johnson, who was an executive manager in South Australian Government, who allowed this to continue. He could see the benefit of it, but you know, we were going over time effectively. The pressure was on. In the next few years, the total of land and soil attributes to be mapped reached 40. There they all are. So in a few years we went from 2 to 40. David developed the criteria for most of those, along with help from us and Ken Weatherby and lots of information. I'll just mention that. Classification criteria for each attribute were based on publications, often American publications from the 50s to the 70s, South Australian publications, other material from Australia, from field trial results and from the accumulated knowledge and experience of numerous Department of Agriculture staff. As the range of uses of mapping information expanded, including the development of landscape models, there was a need for more attributes to be mapped. So I'll talk in a little while about our crop potential modelling. In crop potential modelling rules, roughly 30 attributes are normally assessed. And that's an example of the land classification criteria for wheat. That's that is the land classification criteria for wheat in South Australia. That's just the first part of the rules. The rules go on for about another 2 pages. Known critical levels were used as class cut-offs wherever possible. For example, in mapping or classifying acidity, a pH of 5.5 was the cut-off for the lowest acidity class, or for available water holding capacity, a cut-off of 100 millimetres was the cut-off, because that's South Australian agronomists considered that was where there was no limitations imposed on the crop. Now I'll just mention briefly data statistics. Data statistics, this is areas in hectares of land affected by certain attribute conditions. Processes were developed and programmed into GIS, for example, so that the area affected by high salinity, which is classes 5 to 8 of salinity, could be determined for any area of interest. These data statistics are often more important than the maps. The maps are limited in the amount of information they can display, but the data statistics take account of all the information that's associated with each map unit. And they provide much better information than the traditional back of the envelope calculations. It still amazes me that even in esteemed journals there will be a figure given of how much land is affected by salinity, for example, of a certain area, and there's no reference. These are made up figures. I can tell you now they're made up. They might have some basis in fact from some mapping in the past, but generally they're made up. Now this is the attribute table, the classification criteria for salinity. This is just the brief table. There's lots more information associated, and if you can see that, you can see that it's based on... Oh, sorry, no, what am I talking about? This is, as we're talking about data statistics, this is the data statistics for what we've named it Southern South Australia. Rather than calling it the agricultural districts, which has traditionally been called, we've called the non-arid part of South Australia Southern South Australia. And these are the data statistics for the different classes of salinity. So you can see how simple that is. You've got, that's based on 60,000 map units, and that's what you can come up with, and you can do that for any area you're interested in. It takes some GIS skill to do that, but it can be done. Now I'll just talk about soil attribute mapping developments in other states, and you see how we've gone from mapping soil types to mapping soil attributes. Now only Western Australia similarly developed a system of mapping soil attributes, and David Maschmedt and Noel Shotnick in South Australia, both national committee members, had similar thinking about the way mapping needed to go. However, the other states were largely moribund, concentrating on databases for soil profile data, soil class maps, often very broad scale, or website development. My theory of that is it's not that hard to collect site data, although all these data are hard won. It's very difficult making that transition from site data to a mapping unit, and then how do you describe the map unit? How are you consistent? Not an easy task, and I think that's why mapping in lots of parts of Australia did not develop. I think also there are examples of what a systematic program can produce, and that's the systematic program led by David Maschmedt compared to a non-systematic program where there's lots of people not being coordinated very well. Some states, amazingly, are still not convinced of the need to develop spatial soil attribute information. Now, I mentioned the national soil attribute mapping developments. Now, given the slow rate of mapping in most states, as well as the inconsistencies from state to state, the National Committee on Soil and Terrain, via the leadership of Neil Mackenzie, with input from David, developed criteria of its own for a set of soil attributes, and the idea was these would be mapped across Australia. This is the Australian Soil Resource Information System. The criteria were developed in 2005. However, the development of these spatial data has been limited across Australia for, I guess, there wasn't really the capacity to do it. However, in South Australia, all soil landscape map units have been attributed using the national system. David did that. This was only possible because of the level of mapping and attributing with South Australian soil attributes already achieved in South Australia. Now, this is from the ASRIS website, hosted by CSIRO. This is level 4 attribution of national attributes, which is about 30 of. Doesn't look too bad, but this is like the 150. This is the land system scale. This is the 1 to 250 scale mapping, which is not suitable for land use planning. It's not suitable for any kind of district planning, any agricultural land management planning. The scale's too broad, so that doesn't look too bad. Now, if we go to the soil landscape level, the level suitable for planning. So you don't have to take my word for it. This is on a national website, and this hasn't changed since 2001, unfortunately. You'll see the agricultural areas of South Australia have complete attribution. There's quite a bit of attribution in the agricultural areas of Western Australia, very little in the rest of the country. So it has been a good idea, but the resources just weren't there to do it in the other parts of the country. Not that we had the resources really, but we had, I guess, the previous information and the knowledge to do it. There are now over 70 land and soil attributes mapped in South Australia at a scale suitable for planning purposes. Now I'll talk about landscape modelling developments. Because of the need to use land to its full potential for sustainable economic development, to assess where specific perennials and other plants can be grown in the landscape and to manage land better, David Maschmedt developed the land use potential modelling format used in South Australia. It's the most limiting factor model usually, making use of our attribute data and GIS technology. Environmental risk models have also been developed. It's worth noting that a model can't be developed until you have the base data or the individual data to build the model. While the type of models developed is only limited by one's imagination. The data's there. If you want to predict something about the environment, it can be done. These are the models that have been developed so far using the South Australian attribute data. There's on the left-hand side are crop potential models, and on the right side are environmental type models. On the left side, I couldn't fit it in, there's about 20 more crops that are covered, crops and pasture species. Now, the features of the South Australian model are there are transparent rules. These rules can be looked at and can be assessed by anyone. And also, when the rules change, the model outputs change. It's based on objective attribute data. And when base soil attribute information is updated, if there's new mapping or new information is developed, model outputs also change. This is much better than the old system having expert interpretations of soil class maps. So someone might say, well, here's the area best suitable for lucerne or wheat, here's the area that's least suitable, and they might be an expert, but there's no transparency in that, and model outputs don't change when base data changes. Now I'll talk about more recent developments in mapping. The world has now discovered digital soil mapping. This involves the development of soil attribute maps, pH, for example, pH, surface soil texture, and it can also include soil class maps. And the data used is site data, any site data the digital soil people can get their hands on, existing maps, soil maps, vegetation, geology, and any sort of remotely sensed data that's taking information from the land's surface, and digital terrain models, which are probably one of the real keys to digital soil mapping. Digital terrain models are what give it its basis. And also using the power of geostatistics, and it's worth noting geostatistics is a new science, it's not traditional statistics, and traditional statisticians generally don't know anything about geostatistics, so I've found that to my detriment trying to get some work done once. This is similar actually, it's a similar process to mapping using stereographic air photo pairs, but rather than the human brain making the interpretations from that remotely sensed data, geostatistics make predictions via the data used in digital soil mapping. Now, the world has now discovered the value of mapping soil attributes, a process that was begun in South Australia thanks to David Maschmedt in 1986. There is now a global soil map project, and the global soil map is very ambitious. It plans to predict and map approximately 10 attributes, or often called functional soil properties, globally at a resolution of approximately 100 metres. It includes clay content, organic matter content, pH, or this is what they're planning to do, cation exchange capacity, EC, bulk density, and a few others. I believe they'll find 10 is not enough attributes for the modelling they hope to be done with these data, as we've discovered in South Australia, but certainly it's a start. Now, I'll mention some of the digital soil mapping advantages over conventional mapping. It's generally quicker and cheaper. Map products include corresponding uncertainty maps. It's raster-based, little grid cells. Easier to use in environmental modelling with other data sets, particularly gridded data sets. And it's actually, interestingly enough, encouraging new fieldwork because people realise there's not enough site data, so they're going out and collecting more soils data. The disadvantages are it can be very much a black box process where the people producing the digital soil maps don't know what's happening in the geostatistics that are operating and generating the data. There's a danger of very inaccurate outputs that look very detailed and look very impressive. There's a danger of inaccurate maps being used in planning by unsuspecting community groups. and natural boundaries are not used. And interestingly, with modelling, there's a lot of people think you can only use raster modelling, layers that have raster modelling together, and polygons are totally separate. Well, we've been doing various modelling exercises for a long time now, and you can put raster and polygon layers over each other and write rules where they interact. So you don't have to have raster coverages to model. I'll just give some brief examples of digital soil mapping in Australia. The best example I know of currently in Australia is the crop enterprise suitability work in Tasmania, led by Darren Kidd and others in the state government there, and supported by the University of Tasmania, and co-led by Alex McBratney and his team from the University of Sydney. Tasmania is looking to expand economically by developing new crop industries and expand the area under irrigation, and they want to identify suitable areas, which is a key to doing this. Digital soil mapping has been used to develop soil attribute maps, or single parameter spatial data and predictions of these. Now, they've used most limiting factor type rules utilising GIS, and then applied these to spatial data, matching known crop requirements to soil and climate attribute data attached to each raster cell to produce suitability maps. Here's one of the maps they've produced. They've done a very good job. They've done a good work there, using the latest technologies. This is essentially, though, the same methodology developed in the 1990s by David Maschmedt to produce crop potential information for South Australia. The only major difference being that the soil attribute maps were developed using different techniques. Digital soil mapping and raster cells in Tasmania, and more traditional techniques using polygons in South Australia. However, the Tasmanian crop modelling so far only applies to part of their agricultural area, while the South Australian crop modelling applies to all agricultural land. There's an example of one of our crop potential models. And it's always worth noting that that's very much a reduced map. If we printed that out at the scale of mapping, that map would cover the floor of this room. Other digital soil mapping projects have been conducted in other states as well as South Australia, and as well as nationally. There's the Soil and Landscapes Grid of Australia, which is part of the Global Soil Map, headed up by Mike Grundy. But results tend to be only as good as the underlying soil data, which is quite sparse in most parts of Australia. In South Australia, Craig Litticoat of Juna is doing some excellent work while making use of the South Australian attribute data sets. And for example, there's a recent project that assessed crop growth under a range of climate change scenarios using the crop modelling program APSIM, and it mapped and modelled the increased potential for erosion under a drying climate because of lesser crop growth. Now, I'll just briefly mention other achievements of the State Land and Soil Mapping Program. The Soil Characterization Program and Soil Pit Field Day Program, forming the backbone data set. Well, these soil characterisation sites were fully described and fully chemically analysed, and so they formed the backbone data set for the state mapping program to infer what was going on with other soils that were similar. Now, this David set up this program. He also set it up so that we didn't just open pits, go and get some samples and leave again. Just about every pit was used for a community field day, a soil pit field day we called them. Over 200 were held. David set up the format and the theme of those days, and you'd be amazed at how well they work, particularly when you've got small numbers, because you've got the data there with you. You've got the morphology data, the chemistry data, and you just talk to people about managing land and managing landscapes. And what it reminds me of is Fred Hollows, the great Australian optometrist, who, when he was alive, he used to collect data. I'm not sure why, he's probably writing scientific papers or something, but he believed you didn't just go into a community and collect data, you did something for the community, and so he set up his clinics that help people recover from blindness. And there was similar sort of thinking, I think, in that you didn't just go and collect the data, you actually presented what you'd found to the community. There's also a state or soil archive on these hallowed grounds, not being managed at the moment. There's samples from each soil land, from about 1,000 soil characterisation sites. The program developed an understanding of the formation of South Australian landscapes and soils, as well as key soil materials. And this was based on the initial work of John Furman in the South Australian Mines and Energy and Ken Weatherby. We utilised GIS to the full, and this largely thanks to David Tonkin and Jan Rowland. So the ability to store and produce mapping information was greatly enhanced by the introduction of computerised GIS technology in the 1990s. GIS facilitated the production of maps of single soil properties and also led to the development of models using multiple data sets to assess a range of agricultural and environmental factors and issues. There's an extraordinary amount of GIS programming that's stored in state government computers somewhere. It's now out of date, but it still works. Everything I've talked about here today has got some sort of GIS programming behind it, and we were lucky. A lot of people say they're GIS practitioners. There's not too many GIS practitioners that can program complicated programs and deal with complicated data sets. So thanks to Jan and Dave who are here today. Land and soil information on CD, DVD and the landmark book, The Soils of South Australia. Now, thanks to Jan Rowland, a lot of this information is now on the web. It's been a very slow process. It hasn't been a priority of state government, but it's slowly, a lot of this mapping and other information's getting up on the web. The South Australian Land and Soil Attribute Classification Criteria is in a publication called Assessing Agricultural Land, and that's by David Maschmedt in 2002. And it describes the details for each attribute, how it's classified and why, and that's on our on the DVD and CD products. I say our, but I'm not part of this anymore. I'm not in state government. The development of a seamless and consistent mapping framework with a hierarchy of mapping units. So they're aggregated up from the smaller units, you aggregate up. It's too often mapping's very broad, and then you want to know something more detailed, but you can't. And you have to go from small to big. Also thinking of the seamless coverage, that's very rare. Even in geological mapping, they don't bother about that. They do a map sheet, they map it in a certain way, then they do another map sheet that's mapped another way. They don't join. Reporting by land system, so details about land and soil are reported by a land system basis. There's statewide information. David also produced information at land system and broader levels. There's some soil attribute information based on the Atlas of Australian Soils, so there's now effectively a land system coverage across the whole state, agricultural areas plus arid areas. And in the non-arid lands, the agricultural lands, there's this attribution of 70 attributes by soil landscape unit and by soil landscape unit components, so they're unmapped components within each map unit. Now I'll briefly talk and finish the talk with the issues of our time. And I call them the issues of our time because I think the natural resource management issues are the issues of our time. I think there's not too many big issues facing the world that aren't natural resource management issues. Society is challenged by the issues of managing land and soil, climate change and carbon sequestration, food security and population growth, energy security, sustainable economic development, maintaining a clean and safe environment and managing the environment, managing water resources, land use planning and urban encroachment onto prime farmland, land degradation, soil acidification and land salinisation. As well as this, there's a need to prioritise natural resource management issues for the efficient allocation of scarce resources. Communities just don't have enough money to throw around on anything. These issues all require good quality, consistent and comprehensive soil information to support sound and evidence-based policy planning and management. Here, I'll go from a bad scenario to a good one now. I think that might be on Kangaroo Island, where they've applied some lime to their pastures, so the pastures are looking nice and healthy. Cost-benefit analyses have demonstrated the great value to society of funding good quality soil information, with returns outweighing costs many times over, as the information can be used again and again and again for many different purposes. Improvements are needed in the resolution, nature and delivery of Australia's soil data before it can be fully integrated into ecosystem, hydrological, agricultural, land use and other models, or fully utilised in environmental and land management decision making. Moreover, consistent soil information of the scale, quality and content needed for most planning, policy and management purposes is yet to be produced for Australia. And much of the soil information that does exist is fragmented and inconsistent. In particular, the non-arid parts of the continent, which are the most intensively used and populated, and it's worth remembering in South Australia, our southern South Australia, or the agricultural part of South Australia, covers 16% of the state. Something like 99% of the people live there and move around in that area. The arid areas, which people rarely go into, except on maybe the main highway, hardly anyone lives there. Not much goes on there. So it's these more intensively used and populated parts of the country that need the better information. We require detailed, consistent and comprehensive mapping information. The information developed via the leadership of David Maschmedt provides a satisfying point of difference to this state of play. We're not talking about the agriculture areas of South Australia when we're saying a lot of these things. However, the challenge in South Australia is to make full use of the comprehensive land and soil information that already exists. And that's the real problem. How can people best use it? Do they know how to use it? And the idea, interestingly enough, the idea with a global soil map from Neil Mackenzie and Mike Grundy is to produce this attribute data that other people, ecologists, you name them, other scientists will take off and use in their modelling. But my experience is that's, no doubt there'll be very smart people around the world who can do that, but my experience is the disciplines don't so easily cross, and not too many people know much about soil information or how to use it. And we also need to improve the South Australian data wherever possible. And I'll just finish, sorry it's gone so long, I'll finish with one last quote. Soil mapping is one of the pillars to the challenge of sustainable development, by Jeffrey Sachs. Thanks for your attention.
Any questions, comments for James?
I did kind of some early work with David, well, he helped me survive with some early work. The sad part about all this is the lack of political clout in achieving and preventing urban encroachment, I feel. And I know that right back in the 80s, David was trying to say, let's start looking after some of these good resources. But we're still battling.
I've got a prediction that he's an Attorney General, but also he's a Minister of something else, I'm not sure what it is exactly, but John Rao. And he's trying his hardest to put a permanent boundary in place around Adelaide and other areas which only both houses of Parliament can alter. Now, he's got a lot of serious opposition, as you can imagine, but he's not giving up. I think if he's successful, he'll be seen in years to come as the second Colonel Light of South Australia.
But they just lost the vote.
Yeah, they've lost the vote, but he said he'll keep trying. That's one vote.
But let's hope. Let's hope.
Yeah. It's certainly the best dryland agricultural land in South Australia is just north of Adelaide. Freeling, Roseworthy, that sort of area where it's all targeted. Yep.
Just on that topic, do you have any comment about that land as a result of the fire?
Only that I was amazed when I saw the photos I mentioned earlier that didn't look like there'd been a fire at all. It just looked like a wind erosion event. It was completely just bare ground. Soil had been moving around, but there was no sign of a fire, and that was the same day or the day after the fire.
Any other questions for James? I'll just, from the Society, I'd like to thank James for his very good talk. Thank you very much. Hope you like Brett.
Yeah, I do. Thank you, Sean. That's a good
Thanks,
place.
Dad. And just obviously, so David's got a memory of... David, you want to come up? Yeah. So David's got a memory of pioneer in soil science, and we obviously appreciate your work. Thanks everyone for coming and acknowledging David. So. Very good. Barbecue, please join us. Plenty of food. Gum Oval, if you don't know, it's past the main weight building, which is the building next door to here. Just veer left, and that's the Oval. Hopefully you'll see people cooking, so the food should be ready. Please take some of this so I don't have to take it back to my office. Thanks everyone for coming, and hopefully see you at the barbecue so we can socialise. Thanks everyone.
How do we turn this off?
Should be coming up, yeah.